Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of a Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. This week I'm reading to you an article from the 2025 from the January 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine, and this article is an interview about new discoveries about princes in the tower. Now, before I start reading you this article, the princes in the tower, if you're familiar with that, or if you're not too familiar with that, Princes in the Tower has been a mystery for many centuries. They were put into the tower as they were the sons of sons of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward the Fourth. Now, when Edward the Fourth died in 1483, he made his brother Richard, Duke of York, who would later become Richard III, as their guardian of the princes when they came of age. So before that, Richard of York was given the position of helping Edward V rule before he could rule in his own right. But Richard, Duke of York, wanted to become king for himself. So what he did is he placed the two princes in the tower, and he was himself declared Richard III, and he ruled from 1483 to 1485. Until the Battle of Bosworth that brought in the Tudor reign. Now, there has been many theories over the years and over the centuries. This is a mystery that has been going on for like five plus centuries now. Of what really happened to the princes in the tower, who was responsible for their death, if they did survive. If they did survive, what happened to them? Obviously, throughout history, throughout the earlier years of the Tudor reign, there were a number of people who claimed to be, the princes in the tower. We have the famous thing of Perkin Warbeck, but they were executed eventually. So there's been many theories as who was responsible for the death of the princes in the tower if they were killed. Was it Richard III? Was it Henry Tudor? Was it Margaret Beaufort? Or if the princes did survive, were they actually spirited away somewhere? So this article that I'm reading you today has been written it's an interview that's been carried out by the makers of the BBC History magazine, and they've interviewed two people called Tim Thornton and Tracy Borman. And these people, I'm going to tell you who these people are. So Tracy Borman is an author and chief curator of historic royal palaces, and Tim Thornton is a professor of history and deputy vice chancellor of the University of Huddersfield. And the purpose of this interview that these two people did with BBC History magazine is that they've discussed new evidence that have come to light that could potentially shed new light and finally reveal what really happened to the princes in the tower in the years ago, dating back to the 15th century. So I'm going to start now and reading you this interview. So 1 minute, if you could just bear with me. So the interviewer who carried out this interview was a lady called Ella Catherine, and she is the podcast editor for the BBC History magazine. She is the podcast editor for the podcast History Extra podcast. So I'm going to read you the questions and then the answers. So the first question is, the fate of the princes in the Tower is one of the most controversial episodes in British history. In Tim, you've made some discoveries that could potentially give us a new understanding of what happened to the princes more than 5 centuries ago. So what initially drew you to this story? This is the answer by Tim Thornton. You're right, the prince's fate is one of the greatest of our historical mysteries, and I've been investigating it all of my career, which I'm terrified to admit is about 30 years. Previous attempts to resolve the mystery have focused on the period leading up to the moment that the princes vanished after being moved to the Tower of London by Richard III. For most historians, the summer of 1483, when they disappeared from view, is when the story ends. But 5 or 6 years ago, I began to look at the case through a different lens to see the summer not as where the story ends, but where it begins. One of the key sources we have on the disappearance is a detailed account written around 30 years later by Thomas More. He will be familiar name to people interested in the Tudor era, and his account is the first that identifies how the deed was done and who was to blame. More claims that 2 individuals, Miles Forrest and John Digham, carried out the murders for an agent of Richard III called Sir James Tyrrell. When I began looking at Moore's account, I was working against a background of very great skepticism about the story. Many people believed it was a simple exercise in propaganda on behalf of the Tudors, Richard's enemies who were on the throne at the time. Other people have suggested that More was more interested in literature and political philosophy than historical accuracy. He was writing as an abstract account of how a country can fall into tyranny. But a couple of years ago, I produced a paper which suggested that far from being imaginary, individuals or random characters drawn into the story willingly by More. Miles Foster and John Digton were real people. Most compelling, I found that when Thomas More was likely preparing his account of this period, he was on an embassy in Bruges, and the man carrying messages from that embassy back to England was one Miles Forrest, son of the man more implicated in the murders who shared his name. There's even a 1515 letter that has Thomas More's signature at the foot and Miles Forrest's name at the head. Now, that is an extraordinary connection. more stories previously been dismissed as propaganda at abstract literature. In context, the mystery of the princes in the tower. The princes in the tower. Sorry, I'll read that at the end. Sorry. But my research started to connect more very directly to people who's been around at the time of the disappearance of the princes. Next question. Tell us about your recent discovery and what it adds to this picture. This answer was provided by Tim Thornton also. One of the things that makes this story so compelling is that the princes really did disappear without a trace. Until the discovery of the bones in 1674, there were no meaningful traces of the boys. No clothing is reputed to survive from them, nor any weapons, jewellery, or other possessions. But I've discovered a will from 1516, around the time that Thomas More was writing, which mentions a gold chain that belonged to Edward V, the eldest, Edward V, the elder of the two princes. In this period, chains were very valuable and significant items. They would be made of precious metal and jewels, and usually incorporated badges or symbols to express the owner's identity and loyalties. What makes this really exciting is who the chain belonged to. This will shows that the chain was in the hands of Lady Margaret Capel, a wealthy and influential woman and a widow of a former Lord Mayor of London. But most significantly, was also the sister-in-law of Sir James Tyrrell, the man identified by Thomas More as the orchestrator of the prince's murder. Next question. Can you tell us more about Sir James Tyrrell? This is the answer given by Tracy Borman. For many years, Tyrrell has been seen as a bit of a pantomime villain, but first and foremost, he was Richard III's right-hand man, an enforcer, if you like. He had a military background and was an influential figure at court. What also comes across very clearly from the records is that he was a man of ambition, but also intense loyalty. The other notable thing about Tyrrell is that he was later implicated in a treasonous plot against the Tudors and placed in the Tower. And according to More, during his imprisonment, Tyrrell actually confessed to the murders of the princes. Next question. One explanation for the new discovery could be that Tyrrell had the princes killed, took Edward's chain and passed it on to his relative. But are there any other explanations for how this chain could have ended up in his sister-in-law's possession? I absolutely, and this was Tim Thornton answering, I absolutely acknowledge that there are other ways that the chain might have reached Margaret Capel. I think the likelihood of it simply being discarded somewhere and then picked up by the Capels is very small, but it's entirely credible that the prince's possessions were dispersed in a more natural way. It might have been that in the aftermath of Edward V, his most valuable possessions were sold off to wealthy Londoners like Margaret's husband, Sir William Capel. But for me, the possession of the chain by a connection of Jane does add to the suspicion around what had happened to the boys before the chain changed hands. It's also worth noting that the Capel's lawyer in the 1510s was a man named John More, the father of you guessed it, Thomas More. So not only have we identified a physical object from the princes that survived in the hands of the sister-in-law and the man that Moore says organised the murders, but we've also established another connection with Moore himself. Next question. People have spent years poring over every single detail of this case. Why do you think that nobody has come across this before? My suspicion is that because of the scepticism around the credibility of Moore's account, the incentive to explore his claims would diminish. What I've done is not particularly revolutionary in exploring members of Tyrrell's family. All I've done is take a closer look at the connections of one of the crime suspects. How do you think people are going to react to this discovery, especially those who believe Richard was not responsible for his nephew's disappearances? This is the answer given by Tracy Borman. As someone who has followed the story of the princes so closely throughout my whole career, I would say that it is undoubtedly the most significant discovery, not just in recent years, but in my entire tenure as a historian. I haven't heard anything more compelling in this case than Tim's latest discovery. This is the next chapter, and it is a hugely significant one. That said, I know how emotive the subject is. It's a deeply decisive issue. Richard still has an army of loyal supporters today who may question this discovery and stick with their original beliefs. I have always kept an open mind on this, but it's a shame that there are those two camps and you can't just be somewhere in the middle. I'm Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces, and we absolutely continue to encourage visitors to the Tower of London to make up their own minds about what happened. But for me as a historian, this has really changed my perception. This is an answer given by Tim Thornton. I absolutely respect the views of those who passionately defend Richard. I understand why they do it, but I think this is a good test case for the way that historians work. One of the things that people often say to me is that we have not proven this case beyond reasonable doubt. They apply the same standards of proof that you would expect in a court of law today. But as historians, I think we need to try and explain that when you're working on a topic like this, it's almost impossible to achieve levels of proof beyond reasonable doubt. We can't interview suspects. We can't undertake forensic investigation at crime scenes. We have to work with the limited body of evidence that remains. What historians must do instead is to work on a balance of probabilities, and I think that's entirely reasonable. It recognises that among most historical topics, we almost inevitably have imperfect evidence. Why is there so little evidence to draw on this case? Tim Thornton, again, the answer. There was a lot of people at the time and immediately afterwards who didn't want there to be any evidence of the events in question. You've got to remember that Tudor England was full of people who were deeply compromised by their involvement in horrific crimes in the previous decades of civil conflict. I draw parallels with Europe after 1945, and in situations like that, there isn't always an incentive for people to pick over the past in huge detail. Final question. So where do you think this latest discovery leaves us, Tim Thornton? I think the balance of probability is shifting quite significantly to suggest that Richard was responsible for the boy's death and that we have likely murders in Tyrrell, Forest and Digton. Tracy Borman's answer. I agree. When I dig up with the other elements of this case, I think that Tim's research, particularly this latest discovery, brings up quite significantly close to what really happened to the princes in the tower. That concludes this week's edition of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again very soon. Bye for now.